All right. I can share your
Great.
screen.
I hope that
That's
you
good.
can all see my screen. Hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you from across the pond, and in fact, from the early hours of Wednesday morning. I think technically that means I can say that I'm speaking to you from the future, which is something I've never had the opportunity to say before. Thank you, Elizabeth, and also your colleague Amy, with whom I liaised earlier on, and the Los Alamos Historical Society for hosting me. And thank you all for Zooming in. I really appreciate it. So as Elizabeth said, I'm based in the UK. I work on nuclear literature and culture at Nottingham Trent University. And I've been working on other projects, as Elizabeth said, but for a long time I've been wanting to spend some time thinking about literary and other representations of Los Alamos in the 1940s. Well, why the literature of Los Alamos? Well, there's an obvious answer to that. Of course, Los Alamos is where something immensely consequential happens in the 1940s. And of course, it doesn't only happen at Los Alamos. We must understand Los Alamos as part of a vast, indeed, international scientific, industrial, engineering and military network. But Los Alamos is where significant parts of the enterprise culminate, and where a lot of writers focus their energies in sort of imagining the significance of this moment. So the case I want to make today is that not only is what happens at Los Alamos consequential, but the stories we tell about it are consequential too. And I think that something that happens that we might want to think about, I'll be interested in your responses to, is that in being turned into story, the creation of the atomic bomb is quite often rendered in sort of mythic terms as this sort of moment of cultural trauma, transformation in various ways. And I don't mean, when I use the word myth, I don't mean about myth in a colloquial sense, in the sense that we might say that something's simply untrue, it's a myth. Rather, I mean myth in the sense of a potent, powerful cultural story, one that people return to frequently, one that's often ambiguous, one that gets retold in different ways. And of course, the story of the creation of the atomic bomb gets told in lots of different ways. There are lots of different perspectives on it. And the literature explores that in intriguing ways. Many myths are origin stories. And I think what happens at Los Alamos gets narrated as a sort of origin story, how we became nuclear story. And of course, it's problematic talking in those terms. It massively oversimplifies nuclear science, nuclear history, nuclear technology, and perhaps that's something we might pick up in discussion later. But I think it's significant that the literature imagines Los Alamos as the place where the nuclear age is born, even though there might be other candidates for that. So perhaps it would be helpful if I were to give you some sense of the range of Los Alamos literature about which I'm writing. And I'm partway through the project, so I'm really hoping that you'll chip in with suggestions of things that I haven't yet come across. And I hope also that I can share with you some things that you might not have come across and that you might enjoy picking up. So I'll give you a sort of sense of some of the range and then pick up some of the preoccupations that crop up in this literature. It is, of course, an historical fiction. In one way or another, all of the literary texts that I look at are historical texts. The films and TV programs are kind of works of history in some sense. But of course, they're not straightforward history. I thought I'd pick out three to start with that perhaps deal with the history in particularly interesting ways. Pearl Buck is, I think, probably not much read now, but was a Pulitzer winner. And her 1959 novel, Command the Morning, is one of the few that gives you a sense of trying to capture the whole Manhattan Project from inception to after the war. She fictionalizes it a lot. Instead of being led by Oppenheimer, it's led by an invented character, Burton Hall, who's a very different sort of character to Oppenheimer. As the cover might indicate, there's a romance at the heart of the novel. But I think it's quite an interesting exploration of different perspectives on the creation and use of the atomic bomb. It also acknowledges the dramatic shift in atomic physics from the kind of idealized pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, and those extraordinary developments in the first half of the 20th century in our understanding of the atom, to the changes that took place in the context of wartime and the practical application of that physics. So, for instance, we see Burton Hall wrestling, as many of the scientists did, with the necessity of turning away from the open sharing of knowledge amongst an international community of scientists to the cultures of secrecy that pertain in wartime. The novel on the right of your screen, Harcon Chevalier's The Man Who Would Be God, but many of you will know, of course, that Harcon Chevalier has quite a lot at stake in histories of the Manhattan Project. Chevalier was a professor of languages at Berkeley when Oppenheimer was there in the 30s, and the two shared left-wing political convictions in the 30s, were involved in union organizing and other things. Oppenheimer's withholding of the information that Chevalier had sounded him out in the early 40s about passing information on to Soviet Russia became a key element in allegations leveled against Oppenheimer after the war that led eventually to the revoking, along with other things, of his security clearance. So I'll say something a bit later about how Chevalier portrays Oppenheimer in his novel. And a more recent novel, which sadly the title is completely hidden by the bit of picture that's been grabbed by PowerPoint, James Thakara's America's Children, also tells the story essentially through Oppenheimer. Thakara places an anxious relationship with Europe and with European scientists at the heart of his story. And I'm going to say something a bit briefly about how Europe and Europeans are represented in these narratives of the Manhattan Project. Thakara is one of many who tells the story of Oppenheimer as a tragedy in the classical sense. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. There's also what I would categorize as kind of literary fiction, texts that don't fit into the genre categories in various ways. All of these categories kind of overlap with each other, and I'll pick up on some of these texts later on when I get a bit further on in the presentation. What I thought it might be worth saying a few things about at the moment are works by New Mexico writers. Some of these give us interesting perspectives from outside the security fence. Frank Waters portrays a very thinly disguised version of Edith Warner, who was the life partner of Etelano Montoya of San Ildefonso Pueblo, and who ran a tea house at the bridge at Ottawa Crossing that was frequented by the atomic scientists. The novel is a great companion text to Peggy Pond Church's more historically based depiction of Edith Warner that many of you will know, I'm sure, The House at Ottawa Bridge, the story of Edith Warner in Los Alamos. Rudolfo Anaya's Blessed Me Ultima is a work of Chicano literature set in the 40s. And although it only has one chapter that explicitly addresses the atomic bomb, perhaps the bomb resonates in other ways in other apocalyptic scenes within the novel. Then Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony is perhaps one of the canonical works of Native American fiction. Set just after the war, its protagonist, Teo, from Laguna Pueblo, is a veteran of combat in the Far East and particularly as a prisoner of war of the Bataan Death March. The novel is about his struggle with what we would now probably label PTSD as a consequence of those experiences, but it's also about a broader social and cultural trauma and his attempts to negotiate by his Laguna heritage, a way of discovering a ceremony that will heal him. And in key scenes toward the end of the novel, I'll pick out one later on, the nuclear geography of northern New Mexico becomes part of his understanding that will release the ceremony. And then a more recent novel, Elizabeth Church's The Atomic Weight of Love, is more obviously located within Los Alamos. The protagonist's husband is one of the bomb scientists, but it's also about her sense as an outsider that her own scientific ambitions have been shelved for a long time in reluctant deference to her husband's career. Not on this slide, but cropping up on a later one is Nora Gallagher's Changing Light. I don't think Gallagher is a New Mexico writer, but her novel is steeped too in a sense of place. And her central character is inspired by Georgia O'Keeffe, who of course has painted New Mexico very beautifully. And in the novel, the Georgia O'Keeffe kind of inspired character, she's definitely not Georgia O'Keeffe, but she's very definitely quite like Georgia O'Keeffe, has a relationship with the Los Alamos scientist who is fleeing the site and is based very, very loosely on Leo Szilard, who wasn't at Los Alamos, but who was at the Chicago Met Lab, and who many of you will know is central to the story of the Manhattan Project. So the works by New Mexico writers, there are thrillers, there are poetry collections and poems. So I've done less work on the poetry and poetry collections, I greatly recommend John Cannaday's Critical Assembly as a kind of intriguing portrait of poetic portrait of different figures involved in the Manhattan Project, but also figures from locally. So one of the poems is about David MacDonald, whose ranch was requisitioned for the arming of the device at the Trinity Test. The Canadian poet Michael Lister's Bloom tells the story of Louis Slotin, a Canadian physicist who died when a criticality experiment went wrong. And if I had more time, I would talk much more about the portrayal of criticality experiments in fiction, because they figure quite centrally in several of these texts. There are also science fiction and graphic novels. There's some young adult fiction. Ellen Klages, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Novel The Green Glass Sea is really wonderful. The central image of the green glass sea is a reference to the mineral formed when the desert sand fused into a green glass-like substance in the extreme heat of the Trinity Test, known as trinitite or Alamogordo glass. And then there are television series and films. I expect many of you know Manhattan better than I do. I've only recently got access to it, so I'm partway through season 1. I think I know what's going to happen later on, but I'm intrigued to see how they explore that. The BBC's Oppenheimer from 1980 is, I think, available on YouTube. I've got a DVD of it, but I think that's quite an interesting portrait of Oppenheimer and of his relationship with General Groves. So you may find that interesting. The Shadowmakers, you probably know better as Fat Man and Little Boy, and The Shadowmakers was the title of its UK release. And The Beginning or the End is one of the earliest of the texts or screen renditions that I look at. It's an intriguingly inaccurate portrayal of the Manhattan Project, but does try to tell the whole story. And if you're interested in kind of how the film came to be and how it changed from a quite kind of idealistic proposal by a Chicago physicist to produce a film telling the story of the atomic age for a lay audience, and how that changed into something rather different. I recommend Greg Mitchell's detailed and frequently very funny book, The Beginning or the End: How Hollywood and America Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb, which traces the various ways in which the film developed. And then there are also stage plays, operas. I suspect Tom Morton Smith's Oppenheimer might not have made it over to the States, but was staged by the Royal Shakespeare Company and ran in London for a while a few years ago. That's a terrific piece of writing. Morton Smith is a brilliant playwright. There is an opera as well of The Woman at Ottawee Crossing, which I've not been able to track down. So if anyone knows how to get hold of a copy of that, I'd be most grateful. So that gives you a sense of some of the volume and the diversity of the literature, screen and musical culture with which I'm dealing. And I should say that I'm only partway through this project. So I'm on the lookout for more. I've got somewhere over 40 different works at the moment, but of course I'd love to hear further suggestions. And there are recurring, this is only a taste of some of the kind of recurring preoccupations in this literature and in this film and in the music as well. And I'm only going to be able to touch on some of these. So I'm going to say a bit about the four on the right-hand side. So I'll start with Los Alamos and its surroundings and peoples, and say a few things about how they're portrayed, a few things about how Europe and European physicists are portrayed, some of the kind of key historical moments. Clearly, of course, the Trinity Test is the main one, and I'll talk about that, and also how some of the historical figures get represented in the literature, focusing on Oppenheimer. All of those things are talks in their own right. So I can only sort of throw out a few ideas, and I'll be interested in hearing your responses and your readings of those figures as well from the literature with which you're aware. And perhaps in discussion afterwards, we might pick up on the other topics: espionage and security, criticality accidents, and representations of nuclear materials and processes. So let's think about Los Alamos and its surroundings and how they're portrayed. So as an outsider to Los Alamos, and suddenly my plans to visit were rather scuppered by the pandemic, I've kind of fallen in love with northern New Mexico through a lot of this literature, and so I'm intrigued to get a more accurate sense of place by visiting in person. But there is a tension, I think, between a kind of tourist gaze, sort of picking up on the land of enchantment state motto, which I think originates in an advertising campaign in the 1930s. Versus kind of more complex portrayals of places and peoples. So, for example, many of the novels will show scientists acquiring Native American artifacts from local pueblos. They might even be so specific as to mention Maria Martinez pottery or visits to petroglyph sites. But sometimes I think this is sort of window dressing. It's just sort of saying to the reader, look, we're in this particular part of the United States. Maybe there's a kind of, these things are rendered with a sort of exoticism to them. But in other texts, there's a more rounded engagement with, say, local Pueblo nations or with Chicano culture. There's a tension as well between ideas of remoteness and connection. Of course, Los Alamos is built where it is because it was a chance to isolate the project or some elements of the project from outside connection. But a lot of the writing, I think, has some of the qualities of travel writing. So we quite often travel with the protagonists to Los Alamos at the beginning of books, or our first encounter with them is their arrival. And there's a fascination with the processes of travel, with arriving in Santa Fe, with being given the new names, with moving on to the Mesa, with the censorship of letters, with the being cut off from the outside world. And part of the appeal of the text, part of what's appealing as a kind of consumer of this literature perhaps, is a sense of traveling to this self-enclosed community of brilliant minds dedicated to one purpose. But of course, that sense of disconnection, that sense of almost a kind of an idealized sense of place, is always provisional and time limited. The whole point is that Los Alamos is plugged into those industrial and military networks of the Second World War, Hanford, Oak Ridge, universities across the country, the arrival of the British and Canadian tube alloys program scientists, and of course connected to Hiroshima and Nagasaki ultimately. But some of them play with ideas of Shangri-La and Eden. Shangri-La is, you will be more expert than me on this, but was a term that was used frequently or kind of regularly to refer to life on the Mesa. And there's a nice essay by Jane Wilson, wife of Robert Wilson, Not Quite Eden, where she talks about the term Shangri-La and her experience of Los Alamos. And the term is used, I think, so sometimes ironically. Of course, there are lots of ways in which it wasn't idealized. There are lots of ways, there were unreliable electricity and water supplies, there was the mud, there was the dust. So something that's very different from Shangri-La as the idealized mountain monastery of James Hilton's 1933 novel Lost Horizon, which is where the term comes from. But there's also a kind of sense of something rather Edenic, strangely. The story gets told sometimes as a kind of story of original sin and of a kind of an Edenic space and a kind of fall from grace. Obviously, there's something problematic about telling it in those ways. But it is one of those ways that's picked up. So I thought it might be useful to look at a couple of examples of this. So this is from James Thackeray's 1984 novel, America's Children. And in this passage, Oppenheimer is recruiting physicists for Los Alamos. And we're told that he bore tidings of a lonely mountain fastness to which the best intellects would go, as to some Acropolis or Vatican, court of the Brandenburg or Bauhaus, leaving behind the torments and security screens of the war, the unrest of the industrial cities, and petty intrigues of faculties. where in the simple freedom of untouched nature, with the finest equipment, they would stand face to face with the fundamental laws of the firmament. So in this passage, it's being sort of sold as this very appealing kind of escape from the rest of the world. And of course, it's an escape that brings people back to the world later on. Or in Frank Waters' The Woman at Ottery Crossing, a fictional scientist, Edmund Gaylord, looks up at Los Alamos. At the junction below, he stopped and looked back. Up above, the tech area complex of laboratories and shops stood out on the edge of the sheer high cliff, flooded with spotlights, white and shining against dark sky and black mountain walls. It gleamed with all the romantic unreality of a medieval castle, an isolated monastery in mysterious Tibet. A queer tingle raced up his spine. For the first time, he realized why it was beginning to be called Shangri-La, the forbidden city of atomic research. And then other writers begin to draw other kinds of connections between Los Alamos and the local environment. So Dexter Masters, who was not only a writer of fiction, he co-edited with Catherine May in 1947, I think, 1946, a book, One World or None, in which scientists, including Oppenheimer, including Einstein, including several others, explained the new world of nuclear physics to the lay reader. So he had a lot of sort of involvement with this. But in his novel, The Accident, which is based on the story of Louis Slotin and based around Louis Slotin's very kind of gruesome and upsetting death, he begins by drawing analogies between ceremonies in the pueblos and ceremonies or the rituals of science. In ceremonies that have been performed around here for centuries, he writes, and are still performed in pueblos down from the mesas, there is a transmuting moment when the priest says the word that brings in the magic. But that word transmuting and the idea of transmutation is a recurrent theme, the transforming of one thing into another. And it was like this with the work whose potency Los Alamos was built to secure. The ceremonies had been going on for years in inquiring minds the world around. And then while the scientists danced with excitement in their laboratories like priests at a fiesta, the word was said, fission, the magic was brought in, everything was potent, and the construction of the city began. What we begin to see here is the ways in which, rather unfairly probably, nuclear physics becomes symbolic of something much bigger. It's sort of invested with this idea of magic. Of course, it is just physics. But it's invested with these kind of supernatural qualities and some of the ways in which it's imagined in the culture. We see this sort of borne out as well in other places. Another voice from kind of outside the mesa is in Leslie Marmon Silko's Ceremony. So the central character who's suffering trauma, having returned from the Second World War, has a moment of vision towards the end of the book where he perceives the nuclear geography of New Mexico and begins to draw connections that for him kind of resonate with some of the things that he's experiencing. Trinity site, where they exploded the first atomic bomb, was only 300 miles to the southeast at White Sands. And the top secret laboratories where the bomb had been created were deep in the Yemes Mountains on land the government took from Cochiti Pueblo. Los Alamos, only 100 miles northeast of him now. There was no end to it. It knew no boundaries, and it had arrived at the point of convergence, where the fate of all living things and even the earth had been laid. Obviously, there's a kind of particular perspective on the bomb project there, but their sense of the place that at the beginning of many texts is presented as remote, becoming the heart of a new world, comes over very strongly, I think, in that passage. And one of the things that books do, as well as sort of exploring the places and peoples of New Mexico, is also sort of think about the people who've come over from Europe and the European physicists, many of them, of course, fleeing fascism in Europe. And there's only a chance to kind of touch very briefly on this. I'm sorry that I can only give you a kind of schematic sketch, but I'm happy to talk about it more in discussion. But I think one of the things that happens is that many of the stories tell the story of the European physicists as one of becoming American, as of course many of them did. So there's a scene in the BBC's Oppenheimer where Groves is interrogating Oppenheimer about his communist associations. And he says to Oppenheimer, "I just don't understand it. You're an American. If you were born in some godforsaken European slum, I could understand why you'd be a communist. But you're an American." And he says, "You know, we've got the best athletes, we've got the best businessmen, we've got the, surely you're not going to tell me we haven't got the best physicists." And Oppenheimer replies, "Well, yes, some of the best physicists are indeed American, but there's also Enrico Fermi and Segrea from Italy, there's Hans Bethe from Germany, there's Wigner and Teller from Hungary." And Groves interrupts him and says, "And where are they now, these fellas with the funny names? They're in the United States, and that's it, the American way. If we can't grow them ourselves, we bring them in, bring them. They fight to get in. This is the American century." Now, I think the depiction there is, I mean, unfair on Groves, and it's sending him up somewhat. But it's beginning to sort of set up a sort of an idea of what's at stake is a certain sort of national story, and a sort of tension between sort of national and sort of international perspectives comes through there. There's another example in Pearl Buck's Command the Morning, where there's a similar kind of process of becoming American. And in this scene, a fictional scientist, Stephen Coast, is out walking with another physicist, and the child of of Ernest Weiner, who's, I think is meant to be Eugene Wigner, but in very kind of loose form, sort of runs across. And we see that this boy is growing up, it has adopted a different life. Two boys raced by pursuing a ball, and the men swerved to let them past. Stephen recognized Jim Weiner, the son of Ernest Weiner, but the son had eaten American meat and had drunk his fill of milk. He was inches taller already than his foreign-born father. The boy threw him a bold and careless look he had turned here, the American look, and how different it was from his father's cautious courtesy. Ernest Weiner had learned to cringe and apologize, and the son had never known the need for either. So there's this kind of freedom that this boy feels that his father didn't feel growing up in more threatening circumstances in Europe. So there's a sort of transatlantic theme, and throwing out a couple of quotations like that kind of massively oversimplifies how many of these texts explore that transatlantic theme and the relationship between the kind of the old and the new worlds. Joseph Cannon, whose wonderful thriller Los Alamos is very kind of good on these things, has as its main character a man called Mike Connolly, who's traumatized by experiences in Europe and by the news coming from Europe, the kind of the horrors that are taking place on the European continent. And Connolly, at the beginning of the book, Connolly is sent to Los Alamos to investigate a murder. And he thinks at first that it's going to be an escape. He's hoping that it will be a nice sort of straightforward crime of passion, but actually it turns out, of course, to be about the leaking of atomic secrets and tied up with other things. The novel engages in really intriguing ways, I think, with I suppose the sort of ways in which America gets drawn into kind of engagements around the world, and to the ways in which the text might explore the idea of kind of who we are and who they are. So there's a very moving scene where Connolly comes across two of the German physicists, or formerly German physicists, who have got a copy of Life and the Life magazine, and are seeing news for the first time, or images for the first time, of the horror of the concentration camps in Europe. And the full scale of the Holocaust is becoming apparent to them. And there's this world that they've lost, and Connolly feels that he's intruding on this very private moment. But he gets talking to them, and conversation turns to the atomic bomb, and Connolly says, if someone has to have it, the atomic bomb, I'm glad it's us. The blunt pragmatism of the answer roused Eisler, one of the physicists, and his faraway milky eyes gleamed with attention. Why? Because we're not monsters. I say we, I'm American too, but perhaps I don't trust us quite so much. Once, perhaps, not now. We have all learned to be monsters in this war. I wonder, are those lessons we forget? And I don't think this is a, I don't think this is a sort of passage about condemning the bomb project particularly. I think it's a passage about the ways in which kind of war draws in, draws people into acting in kind of ways that that kind of compromise them necessarily. Perhaps this is a point at which to turn to the Trinity Test. So the Trinity Test, of course, is the culmination in many of the texts of their plots. A lot of them end up at the test site at Trinity, or they have it as a significant moment. It's not the central moment in all of them, but it's there as a key one. And a few years ago, I sort of started going through and kind of mapping where various protagonists in these novels were at Trinity. So Martin Cruz Smith's novel Stallion Gate has someone actually at ground zero, sort of fleeing the tower at the end of the novel. And in Pearl Buck's novel, we've got someone at the S10,000 bunker, and of course Oppenheimer is there as well. Michael Connolly in Joseph Cannon's novel is Campania Hill. We've got a child who's run away from home above the lava flats in Paul Zindel's The Gadget, and we've got various other people kind of off base. And I realized quite quickly that doing this sort of mapping process doesn't get you very far. I mean, it's quite pretty and it's quite fun, but it doesn't really get you very far. But what it did bring home to me is the extent to which, laid over and over, we get these retellings of the same incident from different perspectives. So you can lay on the characters from many more texts. But what doing, and it wouldn't get you very far, but what perhaps doing it does do is bring home the sense in which the space of the Trinity's test site is reimagined and reimagined and reimagined, overlaid in the imagination as it's replayed and replayed with variations in each iteration. It becomes a sort of palimpsest. A palimpsest is a piece of parchment on which something's written and then rubbed out and something else is written on top of it. And so you get these kind of layerings of writings, and some of the earlier writings are often sort of still visible through underneath the other ones. And there's a kind of ghostly persistence of previous representations in each one. And of course, there are things that repeat in many of these depictions of the Trinity Test. So the drama of the postponement of the test until just before dawn, and the thunderstorm, of course, provides a useful sort of tool for writers to build tension. Enrico Fermi's mischievous, not really kind of that serious offer to take bets on whether the test would ignite the atmosphere appears in almost all of them. And in some of them is kind of presented as if a kind of real possibility. Inevitably, it becomes very hard for writers to resist Oppenheimer's retrospective reflection that the words of the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I'm become death, the destroyer of the worlds," went through his mind. And in some cases, fictions actually have him sort of saying these words at the test site, although as far as his brother Frank recalls, he simply said it works. And there are kind of other, Kenneth Bainbridge's sort of famous, with apologies for the language, famous comment that now we are all sons of bitches sort of makes its way into several of the texts as well. But of course, they tell the story in different ways, and it's significant in different ways for different writers. For many of them, it is a new dawn. It happens after all, a few minutes before dawn. You have this very bright thing, which is compared to the sun. Of course, you know, what else would you compare it to? And you have this sort of sense of a moment of transition, this sort of moment of rupture and rapture. We can see a specific example if we look at an eyewitness account. So this is Thomas Farrel, who was one of the kind of assistant to Groves, who was present at the test site. And this is written very quickly after the test at General Groves's request. And he writes about the quality of the light. The whole country was lighted by a midday sun. It was golden, purple, violet, grey, and blue. It lighted every peak, crevasse, and ridge of the nearby mountain range with a clarity and beauty that cannot be described, but must be imagined. It was that beauty that great poets dream about, but describe most poorly and inadequately. And then in Pearl Buck's novel, we get a similar sort of rendition. So I think Farrel must be the source here. The mountains were black and then glittered into brilliant relief and searing light. Colours splashed over the landscape, yellow, purple, crimson, grey. Every fold in the mountain sprang into bold lines. Every valley was revealed. Every peak stood stark. And then a short excerpt from John Canaday's poem, Thomas Farrel, which is obviously directly evoking Farrel in its title. The whole great world beyond our shelter, seared by light, golden, purple, blue and grey, more brilliant many times, the midday sun. Canaday's poem begins, poets dream of clarity and beauty. Even hell has its finer points. I think there's something about how do we imagine this? Farrel himself is actually, although he says we can't describe this, I think he described it very eloquently. But he's saying we need poets to describe this, or we need writers to describe this, although he himself is describing it very well. And then another reworking occurs in the 60s in Frank Waters' The Woman at Otway Crossing. So at the moment of the test, we're told a blind girl seated at a window in Albuquerque, 120 miles away, spoke quickly to a companion. What is that bright flash in the sky? Gaylord, Edmund Gaylord, who's a fictional scientist, face down on the ground with his eyes closed, felt the same sudden sensation of light on his eyelids. He cautiously opened his eyes. The ground beneath him was so brilliantly lit he could distinguish its tiny grains of sand. He turned his head slightly. The whole area was clear, as if seen in the brightest daylight. A mountain range stood out in bold relief. What he saw was at once beautiful and terrifying. A huge searing ball of fire, brighter than the midday sun, was boiling violently, swiftly expanding in size and slowly, majestically rising straight into the sky, changing in colour from livid red to yellow, grey, blue and purple. And here and in other renditions, there are a number of things going on, I think. So one of the questions that's raised is, I think, by this literature is how do you describe something that is entirely new or seems entirely new? How do you describe something that is so overwhelming, so beyond the human scale of recognition? One of the ways of doing that is to reach for models that are already around, of kind of rhetorical models for describing things that are not the same, but maybe a bit similar. So the idea of beauty and terror is something quite often caught up in traditions of representing sort of nature that date from the Romantic period, the late 18th century and the early 19th century, when a kind of new fascination arose with nature in all its sort of power and terror and beauty. So when mountaintops and stormy seas and kind of nature and its kind of terrifying but beautiful sort of dimensions confronts us. And I think, inevitably these representations draw on that. I think as well there's a sense in which, if we think about, what do we kind of associate in art or maybe in literature with revelations of great power and of bright lights and shining lights. Of course, there's a kind of religious discourse that's invoked here as well. There's being in front, sometimes literally kind of prostrate in front of something overwhelming that one can't quite control. And of course, it has mythic dimensions. So the Prometheus myth, of course, gets invoked. Oppenheimer himself invokes it after the war. Kai Bird and Martin Sherwin's got a wonderful biography of Oppenheimer, an extraordinarily detailed biography, is subtitled The Modern Prometheus. And of course, Prometheus is the person who steals fire from the gods. And this idea of a kind of stealing fire and of a kind of a moment in human history more broadly is something that comes over very strongly. It's there in William Lawrence, the New York Times journalist's accounts of Trinity. It's there actually in nuclear texts that predate the Manhattan Project. So H.G. Wells's The World Set Free, which is the first novel to imagine atomic power, not that accurately, but to imagine it nonetheless, talks about people snaring the sun and likens the acquisition of atomic power to learning the secret of fire. So there's something about these kind of deep mythological stories about uncovering knowledge and what follows from that. Other images, of course, are of birth and of certain kinds of birth, and that imagery is used in different ways. And also kind of the connection between what happens here and then elsewhere is brought out. So many of the texts segue from Trinity to some sort of reflection from different perspectives on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or other sorts of consequences. So Dexter Masters' novel, for example, The Accident, makes reference to New York Times stories from the summer of 1945 and 1946 about radioactive fallout from the Trinity Test. And the first story, I think, is late August 1945, possibly September 1945, when the Kodak camera film company get complaints from customers that some of their film has been exposed, that there are dots on the film, and eventually this is traced to packaging in the Midwest that have been exposed by fallout from the Trinity Test. So you've got this sense of kind of connection from this place to broader things. And central to many of these depictions, of course, as well, is the portrayal of Robert Oppenheimer. And I'm conscious that it's not really possible to do justice to the complexity either of Oppenheimer or of the literary portrayals of him. So I will just raise a few kind of questions about that and pick out a few things and draw attention to a few representations, and then perhaps I'll close and invite your thoughts on the literature of the Manhattan Project. Richard says, well, of course, there are eyewitness accounts of the Trinity Test as a sun. These are more eyewitness accounts of this kind of overpowering sense of a sun. There's a focus on clarity of vision, but also being blinded. Rabi's description, Isidore Rabi, who goes on to discover nuclear magnetic resonance used in MRI scanners, writes of the brightest light I've ever seen, or that I think anyone has ever seen. It blasted, it pounced, it bored its way right through you. It was a vision that was seen with more than the eye. This sense of a kind of physical quality to the light comes over very strongly. So depictions of Oppenheimer. So Oppenheimer isn't a central figure in all of the texts, of course, although he is in some of them, and he is in the three that I've picked out here. But of course, he is a figure who is easily kind of caricatured, where he's a more minor figure. So there are lots of shorthand ways for people to signal that the presence of Oppenheimer. Of course, the pork pie hat, of course, the smoking, of course, the martinis, the charismatic, compelling, kind of waspish personality, the piercing eyes. These are sort of ways of having this figure as significant, but on the sort of boundaries of the action. And of course, the texts are intrigued by what happens to Oppenheimer after the war, by the connections between that and his interests in communism before the war, and with the transition from this figure who is this kind of heroic figure who can be represented purely by his hat, as he's on an edition of Physics Today in 1946, because he's so recognizable, to someone who then has his security clearance revoked in 1954. This story is quite often told as a kind of tragedy, almost a sort of Shakespearean tragedy of someone undone by a tragic flaw, their moment of kind of realization when it's too late of what's happening to them. These novels, I think, are interesting because they're focused in part on how Oppenheimer is seen by other people. And I'm very conscious in reading the literature of Los Alamos that there are real people involved, there are real consequences to what's built at Los Alamos, all sorts of complex consequences. And that there's this kind of voyeuristic kind of compulsion, I think, to look at Los Alamos in particular ways and to mythologize these people who are kind of complex personalities. Chevalier's novel, so Chevalier, as I said, kind of has interests in putting a particular view of Oppenheimer in the version of, in the form of Sebastian Bloch, his fictionalized version of Oppenheimer. And we see Oppenheimer, as we do in several of the texts, through security agency reports on him. So one of our first introductions to him is one of the characters, Mark, who's an agent who's trying to inveigle his way into Oppenheimer's confidence, is given a report on Oppenheimer, which seems, I'm not familiar with the kind of discourse of FBI agent reports, but I'm guessing this isn't the kind of the normal sort of way of writing. But the agent feels in Chevalier's novel that an account of the man, even a cursory one, would be incomplete without the mention of a quality which strikes all who approach him, and which, for want of a better term, I will call his spirituality. It is a truly indefinable quality and can perhaps most helpfully be likened to a kind of invisible light that radiates from his presence. And I suspect the use of the word radiates isn't accidental there. If he were living in an age of faith, one would be tempted to regard him as touched with saintliness. And so you see this kind of compelling quality in this depiction of Oppenheimer. And it carries through when Mark, the agent, first encounters Oppenheimer at a party, I think. And before he sees Oppenheimer, he sees someone looking at Oppenheimer. Mark's eyes, we're told, were caught by a face. The young man, no doubt a student, was looking at something, or probably at someone. It was a look of unconscious, self-effacing intentness, a look of surrender, but illuminated by the object of its contemplation, that Mark could only liken to one of worship. And so this idea of kind of worship, again, you might want to think about that perhaps afterwards, and what some of the kind of problems with thinking about Oppenheimer in those terms are, but also how that captures some of that kind of charisma, which was clearly important to the ways in which he managed his responsibilities at Los Alamos. Louisa Hall's Trinity is a much more recent novel, 2014, I think. And this is, I think the novel's interesting because it's acutely aware of the fact that we've all already, or many of her readers will already have seen Oppenheimer, either through histories or through other depictions. So we don't get a direct representation of Oppenheimer, we get it through the perspectives of different people. So one is an FBI agent who's outside Jean Tatlock's house when Oppenheimer visits in San Francisco a few weeks before Tatlock, Oppenheimer's lover, commits suicide. And then also there's one is a Women's Auxiliary Corps woman at Los Alamos who's having an affair with one of the physicists and who comes across Oppenheimer. And they all call him different names in the book, almost all of them do. So one of them refers to him as Op, another as Oppie, another as Opye, another as Robert, another as sort of Chester, this is long after the war in that case, another one as Oppenheimer, another one always refers to him as Robert Oppenheimer. And so he's sort of registered by the kind of way in which he marks the people whose lives he touches tangentially. So this quotation is from the first narrator of the novel, Sam Cassell, who's the FBI agent and who's tracing Oppenheimer and loses him and then sees him again. But then there was that pork pie hat sailing ahead, and then I maneuvered myself to see his whole body. He was leaning forward, walking with one hand stuffed in his pocket. Even now I can see it so clearly, the way he walked with that jerky stride, like a big marionette. He moved in a way that was slightly unnatural, as if someone else had the strings and was awkwardly controlling the movements. And so I think in that image of the Oppenheimer as a marionette, you've got this sense of him, even though he's this kind of extraordinarily important figure of not being in control, that there are forces that are moving him and that are leading to what will happen much later after the war. Later, Sam Cassell comments, it's a strange thing watching people you've never met. You stand outside their house on the sidewalk, and after a while you start to imagine you know them. And I don't know what Louisa Hall's sort of intent was in writing that line, but I feel there is something, there's something we're thinking about there in terms of kind of reading about Oppenheimer, that you start to imagine, he's depicted so many times, you start to imagine you know him, and of course you don't, all you know are these representations of him. And I'm fascinated to see what the film that's it's in its early production stages does with Oppenheimer, how it retells that story. And then finally, I'll close on this. I'm sorry, I've overrun slightly. Lydia Millet's O Pure and Radiant Heart, I think, is intriguing for having a rather unusual take on Oppenheimer. Ingeniously, Millet has a sort of moment of magic at the beginning of her novel, by which Robert Oppenheimer, Leo Szilard, and Enrico Fermi, sort of other kind of key physicists, reappear in the 21st century. So they're transported at the moment of the Trinity Test to the 21st century as they are. And their lives are sort of carried on, we're to understand, but they've somehow, as they are in 1945, turned up in New Mexico in the 21st century. And they're adopted by a Santa Fe woman, Anne, and her rather nonplussed husband, Ben. And they're trying to work out why they're there. Leo Szilard is convinced that they've been brought back to campaign against nuclear weapons. The others are rather skeptical about his idea. And eventually they get recognized, and there's this sort of cult grows up around them. Someone is convinced that Oppenheimer is the new Messiah and the messenger of the rapture. Oppenheimer Millet has some sort of fun with this idea. Oppenheimer has to learn email to deal with his fans. Teenage groupies start smoking Dunhills to try and imitate Oppenheimer. But they're also very moving scenes. So there's a scene where Oppenheimer watches again and again the footage of the Trinity Test at the Bradbury Science Museum, trying to make sense of what happened. And of course, I think what all this literature is doing is trying to make sense of what happened. And at one point is described, as in this passage, even he could tell he had become, Oppenheimer this is, reduced to a symbol of himself. Because while he still felt, he still shivered in the chill of morning, he also saw himself as others did. Increasingly, his impulses were defined by what he sensed they should be, and his movements were guided by a view of himself from over his own shoulder. So there's this sense of not being in control, of being always being a kind of representation of himself. Later on, he told that Szilard really wants him to take on the full-time job of impersonating himself, the service he had dreamed he'd never dreamed he would be called upon to perform. And there's this sort of tragic figure who moves through the novel, increasingly disconnected from what's going on, who is performing this role of Oppenheimer as it's been played out in all these fictions, in these poems, on screen, in music, and who can't escape those representations. So there is much more that I could say about that, and there are many more dimensions of Los Alamos literature that we could discuss, but I think it's better that I end there. And I hope that shared partly some of my enthusiasm for this literature. I think it's a rich and interesting and complex literature, but also introduced a sort of few ideas that might be interesting to think about. And I'm intrigued by. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also sort of intrigued by your thoughts on and your favourite works of Los Alamos literature and what you feel they bring to the telling of the story of Los Alamos in the 1940s. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Daniel. That was wonderful. I am a lover of historical fiction, so I think it's an interesting way that we look at the world, right? So there are a couple questions, and first of all, there was someone joining us from Australia. I think Carrie wins the award of like the furthest away. I have
wow. I thought Nottingham was quite a long way away
in Australia, but I will send you her email because she would like to talk with you further. But let's here's a couple questions. What are some of the greatest or most surprising misconceptions that you encountered about the Manhattan Project or Oppenheimer?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So one of the I don't know if it's the greatest misconception, because I think it's a deliberate mistake. Well, it's not even a mistake. It's a deliberate reworking or reordering of things. And again, I'm aware that I'm talking about something terrible that happened to someone, so I hope I'm doing that in a respectful way. But the criticality accident that kills Slotin in May 1946 is reworked in many of the fictions, and to take place before the Trinity Test, or versions of a lot of you will know it was referred to as the kind of tickling the dragon's tail experiment. I think Feynman coined that. So it's something I'm sure many of you will know that history better than me. But of course it's put there because it feels like this symbolic moment, and it feels like this sort of moment of the dangers of the new age. Alex Wellerstein, whom I think spoken to you before, hasn't he? Has he given a presentation that he's got a blog, the Nuclear Secrecy blog, Nuclear Historian, Alex Wellerstein? I think he maybe gave a talk. Yeah. He's got a very good article on slightly macabre kind of blog post on deaths in the Manhattan Project, and sort of points out that more people were killed in constructing roads than they were in criticality lab accidents. But of course, it becomes this symbolic moment, and it becomes a confrontation with things that seem new or dangerous in new ways. Misconceptions, that's different to a misconception, isn't it? So I've not really answered the question.
Well, it's interesting for people who live here, the way they depict us, or the people who are actually here, especially, I'm not from Manhattan Project era, but I think other eras, it's interesting how people then portray you. So
well, one of the things I'm acutely conscious of, and I hope I haven't sort of crossed any boundaries, that I sort of talking about you must have lots of people who come with lots of preconceptions about what happened.
I think one of the biggest
of different sorts.
People think that Trinity Test happened here. I think that's
sure.
From the Historical Society. I think that's one of the misconceptions that
that is quite crucial.
Like, well, where exactly here? Well, no, it wasn't here. So,
I think the it's not really a mistake in the sense of a glaring error, but there are simplifications of different versions of what of the ethical from different sides of the kind of the ethical qualities. I think most of the texts actually are very good in terms of leaving space for the reader to find their own way into the story. I mean, I think most of them on the whole are actually quite responsible about that. I mean, when you take little excerpts I have done, they feel like caricatures. You know, the caricatures of a particular perspective in some American texts of European physicists, for example, which isn't representative of a lot of those texts, or you know, that passage from Masters about kind of imagining the sort of nuclear physics as a kind of a ceremony that might be performed in a kiva. You know, of course, isn't literally intended, but I suppose there are some that kind of mine it for an easy sort of story, sort of treat it quite lightly, and I guess I'm a little bit uncomfortable with those.
So Chris has a comment. She said, Mrs. Frey was very angry at Frank Waters in Woman at Ottaway Crossing for portraying real people, including her, that he had never met, doing and saying things they would never have said.
That's
interesting.
I mean, that's fascinating to me. So yeah, so Waters is someone about whom I know little at the moment, and I mean, it is a very beautiful book, but of course it's beautiful to me because I'm not depicted in it. If you are depicted in it, that is a different thing, isn't it? And I gather it's a book that had quite a tortured publication history. It was rejected by several people, and then it eventually came out. So yeah, so I'd be interested to hear more about that. You know, about the specific elements of those portrayals that were causing.
And of course, problems. I invite you to come and visit us here in Los Alamos. You must come. You must. You have to come.
I mean, it feels like the project.
Our little town perched on the mesa with your own eyes. It is definitely an experience. It's definitely an experience. Well, now here is a question that's huge. I don't know. It says, do you have a message for world leaders of today?
Oh goodness, no, I don't. No, I'm kind of flattered. I think no. I mean, I think the literature is worth reading. But thanks for the question. But the literature is worth reading because it kind of collectively. I'm not everyone's going to sit down and read all of these things, but collectively they are. You know, this still feels resonant. It's not just what happens in, you know, some of these issues sort of still feel very resonant. You know, these are books about loyalty and betrayal, about kind of how people work in communities, about the ways in which people with good ideals end up getting involved in things that they may or may not feel comfortable with. Yeah, maybe the literature has a message. Intriguing really question. Thank you for the question.
A sociology, you know, study really of how people view these historical events and themselves and how we make sense of things. So,
yeah. And
here asks, is Edward Teller represented in any literature?
Yes, quite a lot of it. So Teller becomes, of course, Teller's involvement with the advocation from early on for the building of the hydrogen bomb.
Pretty sure he's in this one. The critical assembly.
It is a kind of key feature, and his arguments with Oppenheimer or debates with Oppenheimer sort of run through, and of course in the security hearing as well. Teller's role is brought out. So yes, I mean, he's portrayed in different ways in different texts, but yes, he's there very much so. Of course, there's such a wealth of historical material and very good historical material, and from Richard Rhodes's, of course, the building of the atomic bomb, but to all sorts of kind of histories. I mean, I think this is one of the why are people interested. I kind of said, well, it's because this important thing happens here. It's also because if you're interested in writing a historical novel, there's all this material you can work with. I'm
interested to hear what you think about the TV series Manhattan.
Well,
it starts out one way and it kind of turns into something else. So I'll be anxious to hear what you think about it.
Well, I only got access to it recently, so I'm partway through season 1. So I liked. I thought there was something very cleverly kind of knowing about the way it introduced us to Los Alamos. Of course, where does it capture Los Alamos as a mountain town? I don't know. It's got lots of intriguing details. The introduction to the computers. There's a scene early on where I think, is it Charlie gets given the tour when he arrives at Los Alamos, and they say, here's our room of computers, and as a viewer, you've kind of forgotten what computers meant then, and they step in and they're all the women doing the calculations, and so that kind of detail is intriguing. I think there's a moving conversation about the myth of the golem in Prague early on, which is intriguing. So the golem is this figure that's created to save the Jews being persecuted in Prague in mythology, and the story is told by one of the characters in Manhattan, that the golem goes out of control, and clearly this is meant to be a metaphor in the series for the atomic bomb, but then in the conversation they sort of work through different perspectives on that. I think I'll have to answer that when I finish the series.
So let's see. Some people had. Let me look here. Look back at my. So someone says, my family moved to Los Alamos after the gates opened. My dad was a physician. We were invited to Pueblo feast days. They bought pots, jewelry, retablos, beadwork. Everybody wore turquoise and silver. Men often wore bolos at their neckties. So let's see, other text. Someone recommended something here. Let me look. Someone says, you might be interested in my 2018 novel, Last Night of the World, about the Canadian nuclear laboratory at Chalk River.
Oh, okay. Yeah, thank you.
And
Last Night of the World.
Joyce Wayne, yeah.
Joyce Wayne. Oh, great. Thank you very much, Joyce. One of the books I didn't get a chance to talk about, going back to the previous comment, is Tara Shea Nesbitt's The Wives of Los Alamos. Again, you all will have a kind of greater sense of its accuracy than I do. But I was struck by the complexity of its portrayal of relations between the women in Los Alamos and the people who were bussed in daily to childcare, to clean, to cook, and both the kind of the friendships and the kind of exchanges of recipes, but then also the misunderstandings as well. And I think that the novel, those of you who've read it will know, it's narrated unusually in the third person plural. So the women speak with a voice. We did X, Y, and Z. But it's both kind of builds this sense of community, and also from a perspective that's often kind of on the margins of the Los Alamos stories. But then also we see how various those perspectives are, that of course there are, the women don't all speak with one voice, they all have different perspectives. And I thought that was an intriguing way of trying to get into the complexity of people living together in this extraordinary place at this extraordinary time, but also the other complexities of the project.
Sure, and I think there is a collaboration here in this town that's really unprecedented, from from starting, I think, from the way Oppenheimer designed the laboratory, but even filtering down into just the way we operate our county. So
Okay.
interesting. This one, someone recommends the Manhattan Project Trinity Test, Witnessing the Bomb in New Mexico by Elva R. Osterreich. And I don't know if that's a fictional book or not. Let's see. There's Principles of American Nuclear Chemistry by Thomas McMahon.
Okay, thank you.
See any other? Oh, someone says the Atomic Heritage Foundation held a symposium in 2006, the Manhattan Project Legacy, Creativity in Science and the Arts.
Ah, thank you. I mean, some of their resources are fantastic as well, of course, and the oral histories that the Atomic Heritage Foundation have kept, and also there's other great resources. Eric Zaz's the Day the Sun Rose Twice as an account of the Trinity Test is.
And then, of course, Fred has written a recent novel, Irene's Secret Diary, Love, Romance, War, and an Atom Bomb, which
thank you, Fred, for who's been in touch with me, and I'm very much looking. I really appreciate it. If Fred is there, thank you so much for sending me your other book as well, which I gather is there's. I've got a package waiting for me on campus. I've not been onto campus yet, so I'm looking forward to picking that up. So I will obviously be in touch when I pick that up. Thank you, but I do appreciate it. I'm looking forward to your novel.
Universe of Two by Stephen Kiernan is set in Los Alamos. Universe of Two. I don't know that.
Thank you. I suspect a lot of, I will have missed a lot of individual poems as well. There must just be so many more, and I'm sort of starting to work on the poetry at the moment. Those two collections I mentioned are very good, but I keep coming across poems which
okay, I'll do one last comment. This is my last comment. Do you find Los Alamos is primarily painted in a positive or negative light? There's a children's book called The Secret Project that portrays scientists as dark and in shadows intentionally. And we have she illustrated a book called Good Night Los Alamos, which hopefully is not necessarily positive or negative, just as a historical depiction, although it's about the town today. But of course, there are many historical aspects. But how do you think we're portrayed more in the positive or negative light?
I think in most of not in all of them, in most of there is the sort of there are the two simplistic versions of the story, which I don't think really work their way into any of the texts. One is, this is evil men creating this evil thing, which is clearly not a useful way of thinking about it. And I don't think any of the texts go that way. I think most of them are ambiguous. So a lot of them have. So something. A lot of them will have figures as there were, Joseph Rotblat, who kind of left the Los Alamos more at the Met Lab, who were sort of agitating to try and prevent the use of the bomb. There was a diversity of opinion there, and I think that's represented. A lot of the text will have, there people will have brothers in the Pacific, for example, and so it will be weighing up the, kind of how they felt about it versus others. Nora Gallagher's novel Changing Light, I think, is interesting on that, where you have a working through in the relationship between George O'Keeffe type figure, but definitely not George O'Keeffe, and a bomb scientist who is fleeing the project. You have kind of working through of different perspectives in their relationship on it. I think most of them are, most of them are aware that there is a complex story to explore here. So no, I mean, I suspect that the more simplistic versions of the story crop up in where it's more of a peripheral concern in text.
So thank
So I
you
mean, I think
so
that
much.
they are morally interested. They're interested in the moral and the ethics of
Yeah.
of the use of the bomb, but they're mostly they haven't got a kind of particular perspective that they're portraying, I wouldn't say.